Welcome to the call with Nancy Sabato, where we have Christ-centered conversations that inspire and transform. Well, you're about to meet someone who knows what it's like when mental illness hits home and how to find God in the middle of it. No matter how dark things get, God's love doesn't quit, and the church should be a safe place for anyone who's hurting. Amy Simpson joins us to talk about ways to know and how to help with mental illness. Amy, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Nancy. I appreciate it.
You have a story in your family with an experience with mental illness. How did that shape you and what happened?
Yeah, it's impossible to probably fully say how that shaped me because it's just been part of my life for all of my life. But I'm aware of multiple ways that experience shaped me and my whole family. My mom began developing symptoms of severe mental illness when she was in her late teens, which is a pretty much the very typical time in life for people to develop symptoms of her particular disorder, which is schizophrenia. Now, as far as I know, she wasn't diagnosed with that at that point in life or until much later in life, but she definitely exhibited the symptoms of schizophrenia. She got married to my dad when she was 19 years old, so she was right in that stage of life at that point, and they moved across the country and started a life together. And my dad had no idea that my mom was severely developing this severe illness. And my mom, of course, didn't know either. But he began to see symptoms of schizophrenia very, very early, like pretty much right away, but didn't understand what he was looking at, didn't understand what was going on, and really didn't know what to do. So for many years, it was just something that was part of our family life that was not acknowledged and not understood. So this was, obviously before I was born. I'm the third sibling out of four. And with each new sibling who came along, my mom's illness was advancing because she was untreated and it was taking its toll on her. So I grew up in an environment that was affected very much by my mom's illness, but again, we did not understand that. We didn't name it. We weren't able to make sense of it, but it was uh, experienced every day. My mom was vulnerable. She was at times neglectful because of her own condition. And I grew up feeling that I needed to take care of her, and of my dad to some degree as well. So obviously that experience shapes you growing up feeling that you're not only are you vulnerable and kind of unprotected, but needing to protect the people who should be there to protect you. So my dad was also a pastor for 10 years when I was growing up. He was a solo pastor of small churches. And in that kind of situation, typically the expectation and the reality is that the whole family is in pastoral ministry. So it's a very demanding kind of life. And that was demanding for my mom as a pastor's wife and for all of us kids too, who were also, in ministry alongside of my dad and supporting him. So, growing up in that situation, I loved the Lord, I loved the church, loved my family, but didn't knew that we were unusual in some ways, didn't understand at all exactly how unusual the situation was or how dysfunctional the situation was until I was I began to kind of understand when I was 14 years old, when my mom's illness became so profound that she lost the ability to function really and was unable to care for herself in even the most basic of ways. So at that point, you don't have the option to sweep something under the rug or ignore it or give it a different explanation. She had no choice but to get treatment and began to receive treatment and was diagnosed at that point. Although we did not get confirmation of her diagnosis as a family for about 30 years after that, which is also very common for families and for loved ones who love someone affected by a mental illness, especially a severe mental illness like that, because of the way our healthcare system works. The patient is really in charge of their healthcare information, and that's as true for a mental health diagnosis as it is for any other. So my mom was not willing to allow her family to talk with her medical professionals. And so we really didn't get access to that information for a long time. But we over time began to understand, I think maybe this is what we're looking at, and here are the symptoms. And so we knew that she had schizophrenia before we got confirmation of that diagnosis, but it took a long time to get there. So my teenage years were uh, very disrupted and affected dramatically by my mom's mental illness. She was in and out of hospitals. She was medicated and then would get stable, and then often at some point decide that she didn't need to take the medication anymore, which is very, very common for people with schizophrenia. So it was a cyclical pattern. My mom was never well enough to really care for us or for anyone else beyond that point. My dad was in crisis, and so we were kind of on our own. So that's kind of the background to my story. I mentioned my dad was a pastor for 10 years, and after that point, when I was in my teenage years there, when my mom became so profoundly ill, he was never in pastoral ministry after that. He was never able to go back to pastoral ministry, but we were very actively involved in the church, very committed church members. And so I got the experience too of seeing how the church tends to respond to families who are suffering in this particular kind of way. And that really led over time to me feeling a sense of calling to help if I could by writing on this topic and sharing some of my family's story and some of what we've learned along the way.
Can you just give a couple of symptoms to it? Because I know that there's somebody out there watching it going, I know, do I have this? Does somebody I know have this? What are like some indicators?
Yeah. So schizophrenia is the arguably among the most severe forms of mental illness, and severe would be defined as like how disruptive it is to your life and to your ability to function. It's a very severe form of mental illness. There are other types of mental illness that fall into different categories. They're all kind of categorized by according to how they tend to affect a person, like what part of you, what system is affected, and the symptoms that they tend to produce. So schizophrenia falls into the category of psychotic disorders. Also, you could refer to it as a cognitive disorder because it interrupts your cognitive processes, your ability to think properly, actually. And the psychosis, the psychotic nature, disrupts a person's ability to understand what's real and what's not. Um,
Mhm.
which, obviously is a terrible way to live, a terrible thing to try to navigate life without the ability to understand what is and is not real. For many people with schizophrenia and similar disorders, they experience hallucinations. And those can be visual, those can be auditory, where you hear or see things that aren't there, that other people aren't seeing and hearing. And many of them experience paranoia, which is, basically just a heightened level of fear, again, often over things that are not real or not really happening. And that paranoia can kind of take over a person's life,
Mhm.
or they're so afraid of things that they imagine to be true that they can't really function. So I would say, some of the symptoms are, and it obviously it depends on the person, how severe the illness is, how it's affecting them. But if someone is having trouble discerning what's like, did that really happen, or is that really in front of me? Or they're, having episodes where they feel like they're not in real space and time, or they can't quite understand what's going on. That would be a huge red flag. If you know someone or love someone who's seeing or hearing things that aren't there, they definitely need medical help as soon as possible. And even the symptom of one thing that we saw early on with my mom that I remember from growing up was she would be, talking and maybe trying to explain something, and then all of a sudden she just couldn't.
Mm.
She just couldn't explain what she meant. The words would, or she would try to do it, and the words would come out in a way that didn't make sense to anyone else.
Mhm.
So that's one thing too. If a person has trouble expressing themselves,
Mm.
what they mean or what they're thinking, or even emotions, emotions don't come out properly. Those are red flags as well. And those can be symptoms of other forms of mental illness too, not just schizophrenia. Although
Hmm.
the experience of having, that inability to discern reality is really a psychotic issue. And that's more common with something like schizophrenia, which is a psychotic disorder, but it can happen at other times too. And it can
Hmm.
be caused by these can be caused by other things too. If you
Hmm.
experience something like a psychotic episode, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a psychotic disorder. It could be your body's reacting to a medication that you took, or
Hmm.
an experience that you're having. These can be episodic as well. It's really important to get that evaluated, to get that help early on with every single form of mental illness. Early intervention is really important, including for things like schizophrenia.
Yeah. I know somebody who has schizophrenia, and it was very severe. And she went on meds and is so much better now. And you wouldn't even know it. But I mean, literally went off the deep end with me in my backyard, and it was like a little scary, and I felt scared for her, not for me, but I felt scared for where her brain was.
Mhm.
And so that's why it's so important that you can, not that you can diagnose it because you're really not a doctor, but you want to be able to, if you see something off, right, you want to be
Right.
able to know what you're facing. So why do you want to talk about mental illness so openly in the Christian world?
Yeah, but I guess partly because it's not often spoken of so openly in the Christian world, and there's a lot of harm that comes from that. And it's not just in the Christian world, it's in our broader culture. Although we are reaching a point where we're talking about mental illness in our broader culture to a degree that we really never have before. Often that's very healthy. Sometimes it's not super healthy, or done in a way that's not super helpful. But I would say in general, it's coming from a good place because people do recognize, we need to talk about this. It affects many people. The statistics are really high. The mental illness in the US is more common than cancer, diabetes, and heart disease, and AIDS and HIV combined.
Wow.
And yet, when you think about how much attention do we give to those other forms of illness, how much funding and research goes into trying to solve them for people, and how little stigma there is around them. I mean, even something like HIV and AIDS, obviously there can still be a lot of stigma around that, but we've made a lot of progress. Even discussing and acknowledging that form of illness and making it possible for people to go get help. So mental illness is similarly very stigmatized. And so the effect of that is not only hurtful to people like my mom, like my whole family, people like me who grew up around this and felt a lot of shame and felt that we needed to remain silent about our experience. It's emotionally hurtful, right? It's
Mhm.
alienating. And we don't want to do that to one another in general, certainly not within the Christian community. But it also is very harmful in terms of people's health. Because
Mhm.
if you don't, I mentioned how important early intervention is. Only about 50% of people who need help for mental health receive it.
Mhm.
And part of that is because there's so much stigma. Now, part of it is because we have access issues too, which are related, I think, to stigma. But for many people, they just don't want to go reach out for help. They don't want to acknowledge a problem because they're so afraid of the impact that it will have on their lives, how other people will see them. Will it affect my job? Will it affect, will I lose friends? Will people give up on me? And that just none of that needs to be true,
Mhm.
especially in this day and age. Mental illnesses are highly treatable, but we still have a lot of misinformation about them. So I think within the church, we have kind of some special stigma attached to mental illness because we tend to think of it as a spiritual problem, and to react to people as if they're having some kind of spiritual issue or maybe even, you know, willful sin in their lives that's making them feel the way they do or producing their symptoms. And it's just extremely damaging, to
Yeah.
treat one another that way. And it has the effect of keeping people often from getting the help they need, because they're just ashamed to acknowledge what they need, or they're actively discouraged from seeking medical help because they're told that it's just a spiritual problem. So it's pretty important to me that we talk about this and we do it in a healthy way and in a way that informs, that informs the broader Christian community so that we can help.
That's a scary place to be when you're telling somebody, when somebody in your church is telling you that it's a spiritual problem. Because how do you even deal with something like that? Like when somebody says that to you, then you feel like you said, like ashamed, right? And there are people that can point and
Mm-hmm.
and say, it's your fault, but we don't know how this comes upon someone. We really don't. And so, a lot of what you talk about can be answered in your book. And so you break it down so that somebody can really, maybe understand it. How do you break it down for somebody who might be like interested in this subject? Because I know that people are.
I like to start in a couple of places, and one is around just the idea of suffering and the
Yeah.
theology of suffering, because I think we tend to have some pretty warped ideas about that in this day and age, and especially in our Western culture. We are prosperous people, more prosperous, more comfortable than really anyone who's come before us in time.
Yeah.
And it's tempting for us to believe that, and this is not just in the church, this is our broader culture, believe that, we're kind of immune to serious problems and we can, if we have enough money or we have the right job or we send our kids to the right schools or, you know, eat right or whatever, that we can kind of avoid suffering. We can avoid the stuff that hits other people. And to some degree, that's true. I mean, some of our resources can keep us from certain types of suffering. Obviously, we can get vaccinations and that kind of thing, but we
Mhm.
can't make sure that we don't experience the effects of sin in our
Mhm.
world and in our bodies. We just do. We all do. We
Mhm.
live in a fallen world, and I think it's important that as Christians we really understand and embrace what that means. We
Mhm.
will have trouble in this world. Now, the
Mhm.
good news is that Jesus has overcome the world, but we will have trouble, and He's promised us that.
Yeah.
It's very clear in His Word that the rain falls on the just and the unjust, and that as Christians we are not immune to suffering in this world. But I think we really need to challenge ourselves around that idea because it's so easy for us to pick up the kind of delusion of the world around us that convinces us that somehow that shouldn't be true. So I think that's a place to start, honestly, because it opens us up to the idea that yeah, this really does affect my fellow believers. Yeah, this really may be affecting me, and that doesn't mean that something is happening that shouldn't be happening.
Mhm.
Like I need to look for the reason for this, in your own sin or your own life, because you
Right.
shouldn't suffer that way as a Christian. No, that's just not true. So I think we need to have a better theology of suffering. Another place is um, really understanding the nature of mental illness the best we can. Obviously, there's much that's mysterious about the way our brains work, about the way our bodies work. There's still a lot we don't understand about how God made us and what causes some of the difficulties that we have. And yet we do know a lot. And I think it's easy to believe that because we can't see someone's brain, there's not there's not an injury there, or there's not something that needs to be addressed. It's just a not a real problem. Where if I break my leg or if I'm, in a I got a cut on my arm or something like that, you can see that. You can
Mhm.
see that there's something that wrong with my body that needs to be healed. And you can accept that, I need to go get treatment and I need to take care of myself. The
Mhm.
same can happen with our brains. They can be injured. They can be, they can become dysfunctional because there's something that's gone wrong in a process in our bodies, just like it can go wrong with any organs in our bodies. But
Mhm.
we can't see it. So I think it's important that we just educate ourselves on the basic idea that our brains are physical organs. They are part of our bodies. And yes, we have a mind, that's a mysterious part of us that's connected to
Mhm.
our brains, but also, very much just connected with our soul. But
Mhm.
we can't ignore the fact that we have this organ in here that
Mm-hmm.
is very intricate, that can be hurt and harmed, and that sometimes it needs healing, or we need to manage a condition that may not be healed, but can be helped by something like medication, by therapy, by getting enough sleep and treating ourselves well, that kind of thing. So I think those are basic ways to begin, by just kind of challenging our thinking and getting more educated about the way we think about mental illness. And
Mm-hmm.
once we do that, we have a good platform for understanding what people who are affected by mental illness need and how we can help.
Well, as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, trauma is such a big offset of a mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody has a trauma in their life, even as a young child or even as an older adult, that can literally push you off the cliff because you have to deal with it, and some people deal with it quietly, like they don't express it, and then I'm sure at that point mental illness could be set in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that at all?
Yeah, that's a huge issue for people. And trauma there are all kinds of things that can cause trauma for people, and there are different types of trauma. You have, people who go to war and experience these incredibly traumatic events that they can't possibly process. They can't make sense of what they're experiencing. Then you have trauma that comes as a result of like a physical experience where you're maybe again in war, and you have those repeated concussions from explosions around you, or playing football, and
Yeah.
your mind, you take physical trauma to the brain. There's also that complex trauma where people just grow up in a situation, or spend a lot of their lives somehow in a situation that is so harmful that it produces this sort of dysfunctional way of being just to survive that situation.
Yeah.
These are all like they're effects of the living in the world, and ways that are again our bodies are vulnerable. We're
Yeah.
fragile in many ways. We can be injured, we can be harmed, and our brains are no exception. They're also strangely sometimes gifts from God, because if you're in a situation that is unsurvivable without adaptation, and you're able to adapt in order to allow you to survive, that's a gift from God. It's part of how we're fearfully and wonderfully made. Unfortunately, when we make those adaptations in the short term, and then they become long-term ways of living, they can
Hmm.
be very harmful to us. They can turn against us. They can hurt the people around us. So, sometimes those things that we use to survive those traumatic situations then become long-term ways of living for us. They have to be challenged and changed so that we can heal and we can get better and become more functional people. So we are complicated beings, and it's not we it's silly to talk about us in very simple ways, as if we're just kind of there's three parts of us, and they just all no, we're finely tuned by a creator who was very intentional about making each one of us, and knows what we need, but knows that we live in a world that has been corrupted by our rebellion against God, and that we need to be remade and renewed, and that's coming.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that because we want to always focus this on God, and I thank you for that. And so, if you just started tuning in, we're talking about faith, mental health, and how the church can offer real support. So what's your message of hope for those who feel alone in their mental health journey?
Yeah, I would say, for one thing that I can say from my own experience is, growing up and then being a teenager and a young adult, um, who watched my mom suffer, watched the progression of her illness, very much struggled with trauma myself as a result of some of those experiences. Um, I was silent for a very long time. I did not talk about this experience well into my adult years, until the Lord brought me to a place of healing, that where I could begin to do that, and then brought me to a place of healing plus calling, where he equipped me to actually do that with ministry in mind.
Mm.
Um, going but I can say that, as somebody who's walked that journey, and gotten to the place where I started talking about this experience, even publicly, even writing about it, doing this kind of thing that I'm doing right now, it was shocking to me at first, and it doesn't shock me anymore, to realize that I was literally surrounded by people who could understand my experience, or at least aspects of my experience. I had people just come out of the woodwork who were like, "Yeah, me too. My parent struggled, or my I have a sibling who has a severe mental illness, or I've had my own battle with mental illness, and these are people I knew when I was in high school. These are
Mm.
people I went to college with, who I worked with, who who didn't know that I had this experience in my family, and I had no idea they had that experience in their family because we were both silent. We
Mhm.
both allowed that stigma and that sense of shame and that fear to keep us quiet. And sometimes we need to do that. I'm not saying that everybody needs to just go start writing books and, shouting from the rooftops about their hardships, but I will say that as an encouragement, I feel pretty confident in saying that everybody who's listening right now who has a mental health challenge in their life, whether their own or that of someone they love, there are other people around you. Other people who can understand and relate to your experience and who are probably ready to walk with you. They might not know how to do that. They might not know how to do it really well, but there are people around you who are willing and who want to help. So one of the sections in that book talks about how people in that situation can kind of seek help and get some resources for themselves. So I encourage people to take some of those steps and reach out carefully and kind of find those people who can be a safe place to start. And then I encourage them to imagine and maybe pray for the opportunity that someday God will use them to do the same for one another. We are called to comfort others with the comfort that we have received, and it's only the Lord who makes that possible. But in Christ and in His church, we have that opportunity, and He can bring us to a place of healing that will enable us to minister to one another. So I just encourage people to be aware there are others around you who are willing to love you and help you, and that you can get better.
Thank you. Well, Amy's story of finding God's presence amid family mental illness, her call for the church to embrace and support those struggling, and how faith and the church can respond compassionately and effectively to mental illness. So, you can get the book Mental Illness: What to Know and How to Help on Amazon.com and or wherever books are sold, right, Amy?
Mhm.
And, I thank you for your wisdom and knowledge in this subject because, again, this is going to help a lot of people that are really struggling and may not know what to do. But a book like this, at least it breaks it down for them. And you've explained that through this interview. So if you came in late, back up and go and listen to what Amy had to say. What would you like to leave my audience with today?
If you are someone who is looking to help someone, you love someone or someone who's affected by mental illness, or you're just in a church and you're like, yeah, we want to help. I would just encourage people to recognize that it does not take professional qualifications to help someone affected by mental illness. You mentioned your friend who had a serious episode in your backyard. That can be a very scary situation, and obviously you're scared for her. And yet the more we can see people as needing compassion and as human like us, and they are just like us, they have the same needs that we have, they're just affected by an illness that's causing them to behave in certain ways because of that disruption. I just encourage people to think, okay, I don't need to be a doctor. I don't need to be a counselor. I don't need to be a therapist. There are ways that I can help those around me, and to start thinking in terms of like those practical needs that we already know how to do for people who are in crisis. We're really good at that, actually, as Christians. We know how to make sure people are fed and make sure that their kids are taken care of, and even provide for their financial needs when necessary, and clean their houses and get them to school and all of that stuff. We can do that for people who are affected by mental health crisis, just like we can for other crises. We don't have to move away from people affected by mental illness. We can move toward them in the same way that we do other people in crisis.
What if churches were the first place people turn to when they're struggling with their mental health? If this hits home for you, drop a comment below, share it, and let's keep this conversation going. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share for more Christ-centered conversations. Visit the website, thecallwithNancySabato.com. Until next time, let's give all glory and honor to King Jesus.